This final video in the series looking at structuring and designing effective presentations concentrates on slide design. That is, those decisions that you make when designing individual slides that can help your audience understand and make them engage with the content. This is closely related to both presentation design and slide structure, and there will be some clear overlaps. It's important that your audience should not struggle to understand your points from what they're looking at. It's your job to make it as easy as possible. To do this, your slide design should be about preventing overload, which we started to address in the previous video by keeping your overall presentation design simple. Preventing overload will help your audience understand, but there are some other design considerations that will help with that too, such as making sure audiences are aware of what is actually important and what they should be concentrating on at any given time. And finally, your individual slides should be engaging by using high quality content that looks good as well as doing its job. So let's start by focusing on how to prevent overload, which is absolutely essential for effective learning to take place. This basically boils down to not putting too much on a slide at once. Here we have two behemoths of the technological world, Bill Gates on the left and the late Steve Jobs on the right. Bill Gates' presentations were generally agreed to be awful. Just look at the slide he's standing in front of here. It's an abomination. The sheer amount of stuff on the slide means the simple point about Microsoft's remit being equally about lifestyle and work style is massively overcomplicated. Steve Jobs, on the other hand, has had books written about how amazing his presentation style was and how you can imitate it. His mantra was less is more, and you can see from the example here that he took that very seriously. Most academic presentations will probably have more on the slides than this example, but the mantra is absolutely right nevertheless. The less we have on a slide, the more we take it in, and therefore the more we understand it. Everyone hates slides that are full of text, but they are still incredibly common. Understanding how the brain works is key to understanding this process. Spoken and written words are processed in the same part of the brain, and text-based slides with a spoken narration require the brain to do something it can't do. Process two things at the same time in the same part of the brain. Think about trying to read at the same time as listening to a podcast. Even if it's about the same thing, it's impossible. This knowledge formed the basis of Pavio's dual coding theory, which emphasises the importance of using images instead of written words, as they are processed in a different part of the brain. We certainly can listen to something whilst we're taking in images. It's how we navigate the world, after all. Like with the research that led Mayer to create his multimedia learning theories that we saw in the video on slide structure, Sweller's cognitive load theory was developed by testing 3 different groups given the same information in different formats and then tested later for recall and understanding. He found that when there were a few words provided, the group that got both written and spoken words did the best in the tests, which seems to go against what Pavio was saying. However, when there were many words, they went from first to worst. So a few words are beneficial to understanding, but adding more undoes all the good work of those few. So lots of words means less understanding, but a few words leads to more understanding. This explains why having the title is important, getting those few important words across so that the audience understands them, but then filling the rest of the slide with text will do more harm than good. There is an interesting and tragic story that emphasises this really well. So an overloaded PowerPoint slide was said to have contributed to the 2003 Space Shuttle disaster, when the shuttle exploded during re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, killing everyone on board. To explain PowerPoint's role, you need to understand a little of what led up to that point. Basically, during the latter part of the launch, there was an issue with damage to the protective tiles covering the shuttle when a piece of foam detached from a ramp connecting the external fuel tank and hit the tiles. They were aware of this happening and NASA asked the Boeing engineers who created the shuttle to do some tests to try and simulate what had happened and gauge the amount of potential damage so that they could decide whether to attempt re-entry or whether the astronauts needed to try to repair the tiles on what would have been then a very dangerous spacewalk. The following slide was part of their presentation back to the NASA decision makers. So why was this slide blamed? Well, the title was thought to be too reassuring, and this emphasises how important titles are. And important information was lost within all of this text and the complicated hierarchy. This is really important, but it's in the smallest font and on the 4th level of importance on the slide. But it does show that their test results indicated that with sufficient mass and velocity, so if it was big enough and going fast enough, the tiles could have been penetrated. This is actually the most important point on the slide, and it indicates that their tests couldn't actually predict the damage that had been caused. The size of the piece of foam was way outside their test conditions, more than 600 times bigger in fact, but that is relegated to the last point on the slide. And the numbers were very abstract and difficult to visualise. Basically, there's so much information on this one slide that cognitive overload had occurred. The wrong decision was made, and the lives of all 7 people were lost as a result. This truly was a case of death by PowerPoint. Another way to prevent overload is to avoid clutter. That is, things that are nothing to do with the content but are still taking up processing power. As mentioned in the presentation design video, this is one of the reasons we recommend ditching PowerPoint themes, but it's equally as important when it comes to individual slide design. These 2 slides are from the same presentation, so this isn't an issue with the overall theme. Presumably the extra flourishes and images have been added to make them look more interesting, but they actually make them less understandable, as part of the brain will be processing the additional clutter rather than focusing on the important content. It's also reducing the amount of space available to make the content as big as it could be. The chemical structures on the right hand slide here would be much better being as big as they can be. A quick makeover makes the information on both slides easier to take in, even with the high text levels that are still on the first slide. The consistent design is also helping. The same background, the same fonts, the same basic slide structure and the limited colours all help. If you keep things consistent and simple, your audience can focus on the content. Instead of having all of these different things, when there's no changes to deal with, they can all disappear and they're left with just, that's an interesting point. The next thing to consider when designing slides is what else can you do to help the audience understand. You might think something is perfectly obvious on your slide, but sometimes an audience needs a little bit of help interpreting what they're looking at or making connections. We know that not everyone sees the same thing when they're presented with an image or other information. Here is a great example. On the next slide is an admittedly bad image of an animal, but what animal is it? Take a few seconds to look and see if anything is obvious to you. When I do this exercise in class, I have never had a situation where everyone sees the animal and sees the same animal. I get so many different answers. I will stop you overthinking it and tell you that it actually is a cow. As you can see when the outline is added, this is much more obvious. In fact, once you see it, it's hard to unsee it. If I go back to that previous slide, you can see the cow now. This may seem like a silly example, but it works well to emphasise the varied nature of our brains and how sometimes our audience may need a little help in recognising what they're looking at and noticing what we want them to see. A simple way to help is to point to things, highlight things, annotate what people are looking at. That way you can be sure the audience gets the message. Another helpful thing to do is to put things that are related to each other together. This is known as the spatial contiguity principle of multimedia learning, and it helps the audience connect related information. Colour is another great way of doing this on a slide. Here you can see how the pink colour on that white section connects the items on the slide. We also saw this on this slide from the earlier video on slide structure. The words in the title purposely use the same colour as the words in the definition to make the connection between the two obvious. And if you really need a list of bullet points, you can at least ensure people are concentrating on the point you're developing in your narration by using animation. Without doing this, people will read right through the list whilst you're talking. That means they either listen to you or they don't take in what they're reading. So a good part of the hard work you've put into creating your slide and your narration is lost. By animating the points in one at a time, you can stop that from happening, as it stops them from reading onwards and it encourages them to focus on your current point, especially if you dim the previous points, as I've done here. There are plenty of YouTube videos showing you how to do that. Be careful with your animations though. For text, stick to appear or fade. Don't use animations with a lot of movement, as they can get really annoying. It isn't only in lists of bullet points that animation helps focus attention on what you want your audience to be looking at. If you've created a smart art graphic, you can bring each element in one at a time so that you can develop on that point before you bring the next one in. Or if you've got a more complex diagram where you have information to add about the different elements, again you can bring these in one at a time, allowing you to expand on the content in your narration before you move on. Finally, you can use your design to engage the audience by ensuring your content is of top quality and that you are using it effectively. This starts with the images you use. Ensure you avoid obvious and cliched images. Save cartoons for presentations to children or where you're aiming for comedy. This is rare in academic circles. I would also recommend avoiding images that are clearly generated by AI. That isn't to say some AI generated images are not useful, but you need to be aware of their limitations. The image on the left here is from Pixabay, which I must admit is becoming a little too dominated by AI generated images for my liking. I searched for a lawyer in a courtroom, and this manga style image is what I got. It's not really very professional or realistic. I then turned to ChatGPT and asked for an image of a courtroom, and it gave me an empty one. So I asked it to add barristers and a judge. I didn't expect quite so many of either as I got in the middle image here. And finally I asked for an image of a UK courtroom with a defendant in the dock. Clearly the only way that that could be depicted, it thought, was by adding the Union Jack. And the dock is rather oddly positioned in the middle of the room, not very secure. So as you can see, it can be best to avoid these as they are equally unprofessional. Generally, it's best to stick to photographs of the real thing. They're far more professional and they're actually more engaging as they've got so much more authenticity. How you use the images is important too. Make sure any images are not pixelated or blurred like this one. So don't copy images from the Google search results and then make them bigger, which is what I did with this one here. Instead, go to the source of the image and copy it from there and you'll get a much better quality image. Be very careful when you resize images too. You don't want to stretch or squash them. If you use any but the corner handles, that can happen. So drag diagonally on the corner handles to keep the aspect ratio the same and avoid that horrible distortion. If you use the corner handles to keep the aspect ratio correct and then find your resized image no longer fits the space you've got for it, consider cropping it instead. Again, it will look more professional. Just make sure that what you want to depict is still clear to the audience. And finally, if you're presenting at an external event, which may not be 100% educational or not-for-profit, for example some conferences, then you must consider the copyright of the images you're using. Sites such as Pixabay, shown here, and others like Pexels offer images with free-to-use licenses where you don't need to worry about this. The link below this video takes you to our page with other similar sites. Google and Bing searches and image sharing sites like Flickr give you options for searching for images with Creative Commons licenses. and the other link below this video can help you understand these and what their legal use looks like. So could this next slide have saved the lives of those on board the Columbia Space Shuttle? Imagine if the Boeing slide looked like this. Would those NASA officials still have decided to attempt re-entry when the slide is clear, without overwhelming text, and has a clear, simple but compelling image? We'll never know, but it's a chilling thought. So to summarise this video, don't overload your slides. Make sure you've got less text and less clutter. In fact, make sure you've got less everything. Make sure you and your audience can focus on what is important. Signal with arrows and annotations, and animate to draw the eye. And use quality images and edit them carefully. All this should make it as easy as possible for your audience to understand your points, which is what you're aiming for after all. If you have any further queries about structuring and designing presentations, please contact skills@Hull.